It's known.
There you go.
There we are. I know. I do have several announcements, so I will start on time. It's so nice to see students in this on this occasion. It's usually a really faculty heavy occasion. I'm Lori Lefkowitz. I am, for the moment, the interim director of our Humanities Center, and I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of both the Humanities Center and the Office of the Dean of the College of Social Science and Humanities. We co-sponsor these programs in order to foster intellectual community in our college, learn what our colleagues are working on and writing about and thinking about. And on this occasion, it's also an opportunity to meet somebody new. So I'm really happy for that opportunity as well, and I hope you are too. I will introduce our, we also pride ourselves at this college in doing multi-generational research across faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students, but very rarely have this occasion since that actually manifested in a multi-generational project presentation, and we will have that today. So I'm very pleased and grateful for that as well. Since I have your attention, I'm just going to announce the upcoming faculty works in progress because there are some new faces here and maybe they'll capture your imagination. On Monday, March 25th, we will hear from Brianni Swire Thompson, who's an assistant professor of political science and psychology, and we'll be talking about discrediting disinformation sources. Discrediting disinformation sources, the advantage of highlighting low expertise. It's a provocative title and it's also so timely, and she's also relatively new to our campus. So if you're interested, I hope we always serve lunch. And also the upcoming talks are kind of exciting, so I wanted to highlight that one, and also the one immediately following on April 9th is a colleague who's going to come from our Mills campus to give a book talk. Her name is Susan Ito, and she wrote a memoir that's winning all kinds of prizes. It's called I Would Meet You Anywhere. And yeah, so her name is Susan Ito, and she is an assistant professor at Mills College of Northeastern University.
And I believe if I can just throw in that it's an adoption memoir, so it's a really interesting topic for everybody. But
thank you. I did not know that. I'm pleased to know that. And without further ado, I want to introduce Kris Manjapra, who's Stearns Professor of History and Global Studies here at Northeastern. He directs the Black History in Action for Cambridgeport, as well as the New Arts and Humanities Action Lab in the Ethics Institute. I will leave his bio at that, but there's much more to know about our colleague. Co-presenting with James, is it Ikeda, who is a public school teacher in Quincy, a world history PhD student at Northeastern. His research focuses on Black radicalism and the global left in the 20th century. The front person, I love this, of local punk band, the Michael Character, and a co-founder of the local arts and civic education collective, the Bummer City Historical Society. So cool. Okay. Amber Hayward is a third-year undergrad at Northeastern studying anthropology. So all in our college, they are dedicated to making arts, humanities, and social sciences shared and accessible. I share that goal. That's a great goal. Thank you. Please welcome.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Lori, for that introduction and for this invitation. And it's so good to be giving this presentation with colleagues who are also students, and to think about how we actually can do the humanities differently and present differently and maybe even publish differently. And hopefully, this is a really generative model, and we will see more and more and more such collaborations, because I certainly have gained a great deal and continue to from working with Amber and James, as this presentation is going to show. My name is Kris Manjapra. I want to begin certainly by acknowledging that the conditions that bring us here are really tragic. The death of a dear colleague of ours, Professor Angel Nieves, and the spirit of this talk is very much in alignment with the spirit of Professor Nieves. And so I want to make sure to spend a moment because he continues to be remembered by us and also into the future. So let me begin by introducing you to a humanities project. The theme here is, what are the powers of the humanities? And we together, the three of us, are going to provide you with an answer or a set of answers to that question, and then we'll have time for discussion. So let's begin with our next slide. So first of all, some definitions. What are the humanities? Very briefly for now, and this might be a bit unusual to think about the humanities in this way, because generally we could name it in terms of disciplines, literature and philosophy and history and so forth, anthropology even. But in terms of what the humanities do, I would propose to you that the humanities make worlds. And I see Professor Régine Jean-Charles in the audience, and Professor Jean-Charles has been doing 2 events in the from the Africana department on world making, and that's because the humanities really are about creating social meaning, creating worlds. We'll talk more about this and make it more concrete. World making. The humanities are about aliveness, by which I mean they are about what emerges when people come together and share their meanings, and through that are transformed, and the kinds of transformations that are possible. Again, abstract point, but you're going to see it in a concrete way in this presentation. And then thirdly, the humanities are about imagination. They are about imagining what could be, which is often very different from what is or what we think is. And by imagining what could be, in fact, things can change, right? In fact, the could be becomes the new possible. And so let's drill down a little bit more to ask the question, well, what are the humanities in action as it relates to our particular project? And here I have, again, 3 key points. And then after that, we show you the specific example of where our work, the humanities in action, are taking place in Cambridgeport, Massachusetts. So the humanities action can do a lot of different things. Here are only 3 of them. 1, they can affect anti-gentrification. What do I mean by that? Well, think of it this way. Gentrification, we could define as a process by which common property, what sometimes we call third spaces, is made into private property, so privatization. Gentrification also is a process that can alienate us from each other, that can isolate us from each other. And so in a certain way, what gentrification is about, it's about privatization, isolation, and alienation. And what anti-gentrification is about, it's really about the opposites. It is about building relationships through shared experience. And the humanities are unique in their ability to build relationships through shared experience. That's something that the humanities do that is very distinctive to them. Humanities also create spaces for performance. And performance is an event in place, co-created in, and here's a technical term, co-created in an autopoietic feedback loop between audience and performer. And you're going to hear more about this feedback loop as we go, but part of what the humanities do is they create the opportunity for us to again, learn from each other and transform each other in that exchange. And that's what we're calling performance. And then finally, the humanities create shared experience and the ability to be present together, to get off our phones, to get off our devices, the things that often, in some ways they connect us to people, in some ways they alienate us. But when we are in a physical space together, having a shared experience, interpreting that experience together, sharing our different views, our different perspectives, being in that performance, there's something that happens in real time that is very, very distinctive and very, very humanities. The question is, what all does that experience do in the world? And how might it be doing things that go far beyond what we think of, the place that we often think of as taking place, which is, of course, the classroom. So let's move out of the traditional classroom, the familiar classroom, and move to a different learning and exploring space for the humanities. And here I want to introduce Black History in Action. This is a nonprofit. It's a nonprofit that I founded in 2020. It has 3 key goals, and it's relating to a specific place, which you're going to see appear in the next slide. The 3 key goals are the protection against gentrification in Cambridgeport, Massachusetts. The second is research and reinvestment in community. And the third is arts and education in a particular location in Cambridgeport. And all of this relates to this specific place. The address for this building is 137 Alston Street. The name of this building is the St. Augustine's African Orthodox Church. This building has a very deep history, and I want to tell you just briefly about that history, and then you're going to hear in some coming slides us drill down in some dimensions of it. This picture is from 1969, and it has asbestos siding on it, which covered up the shingles that are just last week. This is a picture from last week. Have reappeared because of the historic restoration that is taking place. And to get from here to there, there's been 3 years of the building looking in all kinds of ways as it is being restored. The building, if we were to go back in time, this particular place, this plot, if we were to go back in time, we would come to 1930. And 1930 is when the building was purchased by a new denomination called the African Orthodox denomination, which was formed around that time, about a decade earlier, as part of something called the United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, which was an organization, a Pan-Africanist organization, created by Marcus and Amy Garvey, who were from Jamaica. And the UNIA expanded across the United States, Africa, and the Caribbean as a response to the Jim Crow era of that time. It was a international project for Black liberation, for Black liberation through community building. And the UNIA formed a church order, which is very interesting, in 1921. Under the leadership of an Antiguan bishop named Bishop George Alexander, who was a medical student who'd moved to Boston. It's a lot of educated travel to Boston from the Caribbean in this time, and I can tell you more about why there were so many Caribbean people and the different kinds of Caribbean groups that were moving. George Alexander was also had a religious calling, and he left his medical studies, became a pastor, and eventually joined with Marcus Garvey to form the church order of the UNIA. And this building, which was purchased from an Anglican church, became the Basilica for the UNIA. In other words, it was the international center for the UNIA, and they would hold synods of the bishops of this order at this church all the way into the 1950s. So there's an international story that's playing out at this small building, even as there is a very rich local story. And all of it is kind of a palimpsest. It's all sedimented. And what the humanities does is it has this immense power to preserve, to find, uncover, and preserve these stories, but then to take the stories and to actually do something physically visible with it, and something that relates very concretely to property rights, you know, to ensuring that this building doesn't get sold to a developer and turned into you know, either single family or condos, but maintains its mission as a third space, as a space for community, and a space that relates to those three missions that I mentioned earlier, including arts and humanities, and including placemaking. So let me pause my part, and I'm going to turn it over to James Ikeda, who's going to take us through the next slide.
Hello.
Hello.
I love a lectern. My grandmother, my mom's mom, was her parents were immigrants, and she grew up in the 20s during like a very intensely assimilationist period. And I once told her that I got nervous about what to do with my hands when I was presenting to people. And I said I don't know what to do with my hands. And I asked her what to do with my hands, and she looked at me quizzically, and she said, find the most comfortable looking person in the room and do what they're doing. As though it was the most obvious thing in the world. And I thought it was fair enough, but I don't have to cross that bridge. I have this. Anyway, hello. So let's, I love a graphic. Take a look at it. Yes, there are boxes. Yes, there are arrows. We're talking about stages of this project, kind of, but don't be fooled. Each of these things feeds into the other, okay? But I'm going to talk about them like stages. Each of these also has a dedicated slide, so we don't have to go into great detail. So let's breeze through it. What have we been up to the last couple of months? Archival research and assembling the archive of, mark the phrase, the world of St. Augustine's. The world of St. Augustine's. Finding the stories in the archive and curating a collection through which to tell them. Again, you have to do this, but they feed back into each other. And creating place-based shared experiences. These are the three boxes into which you can put the work we've been doing recently. The research, the assembly of the archive, finding stories and curation, and the creation of these shared experiences through events. Ultimately, all three of these serve this goal: activate the public humanities to facilitate historically informed place-based meaning making that equips a frontline community to materially resist gentrification. With me so far? Yes? Okay. Now, let's talk about the assembly of the archive. Here you have some items from the archive. My predecessor in this position, Dina, did the incredible work of digging through the basement of St. Augustine's and finding all these items and digitizing them and organizing them in some system. The exact nature of which is still somewhat mystifying to me. But it works really, really, really well. And the cool thing about it is there are, obviously, it skews towards paper ephemera, a lot of that kind of stuff. We also have some interesting objects, like this Beretta hat at 6 angles, and also this incredible kind of cookery device. But it's not entirely clear at all, but still, really, really incredible. So lots of cool objects as well as this paper ephemera, right? And part of assembling the archive was actually digitizing all this stuff, but it turns out there's a little bit more to it than that, because you also have to figure out how to make the items speak and say things that are not necessarily immediately obvious at the surface level. So just take an example of one thing we've done here. This is a registry book. Okay. It's not dated, but it seems to be probably from like the mid-1960s is the best we can tell. It has the names of all of these people who were parishioners at the church, and it also, for the most part, has their addresses. Not everybody, but most of them have addresses. What we were able to do is take this information and map it, right? Little Google My Maps. And you'll notice immediately something pretty interesting arises out of this. The archive speaks, and it says something something interesting. There's St. Augustine's. And you'll notice you have 3 neighborhoods which you find in the little address listings. One is Cambridge, one is Roxbury, one is Dorchester, right? Perhaps even more fascinating, this is St. James's, which is another African Orthodox church. Seems odd, right? And yet you have people who are coming all the way from down here in Roxbury and Dorchester and going up to Cambridgeport to attend services at this church, right? You'll also notice in the red you have people. If the house is red, someone living at that address was confirmed in the church, and if it's blue, someone was baptized. These are not complete records because we don't have all of the addresses for all of the people, but it says some pretty interesting things. Give you a second to process. So in assembling the archive and trying to get the archive to speak, we've been able to gather all these sort of materials. And then what do we do with it? Well, we have to take all this stuff and we have to arrange it and tell stories with it, right? And tell stories with it in a way that is true to the source material. I mean, storytelling with objects always requires some kind of imposition of the storyteller in a sense, and you have to be very careful about how to do this. We're trying to find what stories are coming naturally out of these objects that have been assembled. And in doing this, we found that you could form a few, this is a less elegant graphic, but I'll walk you through it. There were a few categories of story which you could tell, right? One, taking the example we just looked at, is geographic, right? There was a geography to this community. Is a geography to this community, right? And it was not just the immediate environs around the church. It also included these other neighborhoods. There was also, by the way, an address in Brooklyn. We've not figured out why yet. But there's some kind of geography. We also know that this is a predominantly Caribbean community, right? So there's a quite expansive geography. That's one story, one circle, right? There's a generational circle. You could find in this archive baptismal records, like children's coloring books from Sunday school class. You could find obituaries from elderly people who had passed. It's a multi-generational community, right? So this generational circle. You have a social circle. That stove is one piece, right? We heard a marvelous story about the smells of the food being cooked, percolating up through the floorboards toward the end of the service to keep people in their seats. The last little stretch. This was not merely a house of worship, but it's also a social space, right? And so you have all these objects that speak to the different ways that the church physically served as a social gathering space, and the ways that this community exceeded a community of worship. And finally, you have the spiritual circle. The African Orthodox Church is a fascinating denomination. George Alexander McGuire, this guy is a founder, comes out of the Episcopalian tradition, right? And then builds an Orthodox denomination, right? That has all these oddly Catholic practices, right? In how they do the sacraments and all the rest of it. So there's something sort of fascinating about the spiritual idiosyncrasies of this denomination, and that comes through in many of the objects, from that Beretta hat to some of the like manger scenes, a couple of different ones of those, the incense censer, and all these interesting objects which tell parts of this. So you can sort of arrange these objects into circles, which we have done, and I will pass it off to my colleague to talk a little bit about how we did that.
Thank you. Okay, there might be some technical difficulties, but we'll see if it works out. But my name's Amber. I'm the undergraduate student who's been helping out with this project, and I was primarily responsible for working on the website of the archive. So, sorry, but let me pull up my notes here. All right. So before I show you guys the website we created, I want to talk more about what it actually means to create a digital space of memory. So with the understanding that gentrification takes places from community, we can also understand that it therefore takes the physical, social, geographic, spiritual, generational, and cultural spaces from communities. But these spaces are not eliminated by gentrification because their meaning making still exists and is founded in family bonds, ongoing cultural life, and in memory. So a goal of this project is to foster present and future meaning making in St. Augustine's Church. And with a digital archive, we're also able to share meaning that has already been made. So this website connects the space, place, and meaning of the past to that of the present and the future. And the memories of place and the spaces anchored by place are now not only individual memory, but accessible and shareable online, which is very exciting. So this is a screenshot of kind of the behind the scenes work we did of organizing the archival materials into these 4 spaces. And the ones that we have are the geographical, generational, social, and spiritual, as James just touched on. And so I want to walk you guys through the website, and hopefully it works, but we'll see how the technology is working. Good so far.
Share this.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Stop sharing.
There,
Did we get-
there we go.
Thank you so much. Okay, so. Okay, perfect. So this is the first page of our website, which as Dr. Manjapra went through, it goes through kind of the contextualizing it in the history of Cambridge and the world. So we have an overview on the first page, and then we have the actual digital archive. So because this is meant to be shareable and accessible, I put a bit of an overview on what an archive is and how it works. Because I, for example, did not know what an archive was until I worked on one at my co-op. So that was a learning curve. So we have this organized into our circles, the spaces that we just went over. So we have, again, a description, and if this will go down, I'm going to walk you guys through the geographical circle specifically. So you can open it up, and we have our description, rooting why the geographical circle is significant and why St. Augustine's geography is so important. And we have our 6 items here organized in the circle. So the first one, I want to show you guys the Men's Day souvenir program, which is one of the first items I uploaded. So we have 18 items on the website, and each is organized like this. It has its title, its image, and if you scroll down, it's information. So the title, creator, the date, description, format, and we see that this one here has multiple pages, and we're also able to select the image and actually go through all the pages of the item. So this item specifically for it's a program for an event, and we're able to see music and also many pages of names, local businesses, people really involved in the community. And also there's a program, the actual events too. So we're able to really, see how these memories, you can really feel the memory in these items through a digital space, which is very exciting. And so let me go back to the circles. We also have another item which is accessible through the geographical circle and also up here through this link at the top of the page. But this is the map that James showed you guys. So this is a screenshot, and if we go down, we're also able to interact with it through the website. So we're also able to actually go through and see all the different parishioners who lived in Boston and also the one in Brooklyn. But you're able to actually click and see the registry and details about the people who are actually in this community and involved in St. Augustine's Church. So that is a little overview of the website. You're actually able to go through not just the circles, but also each individual item and the map. And this is the space that we have created for the digital archive. So I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Manjapra, and hopefully Can figure that out. Thank you.
So are you all finding this interesting?
Yes.
I'm finding it interesting to see how it's all come together, and it's so well, it's a great feeling to usually be the teacher in my profession, but to be a student and learning from James and Amber and the way that they think and present. And that's probably one of the beauties of this kind of a humanities project, right? Coming back to our key theme, what are the powers of the humanities? And so let's move to asking that question in one last way. What are the powers of the humanities? And here we wanted to share with you some of the performances, the experiences of being present together, of co-presencing together, the way that the humanities are very unique in being able to create shared experience. This is a little bit of an album of, you know, some of the work that's taking place with the restoration, but we've put at the center the people who have been brought together, the varieties of people who have been brought together as this work goes on. And I'm so happy to see Chijor in the room, who is featured in this slide that I wanted to tell you about next. I'm going to talk about one event, one specific event that we held at St. Augustine's last year, and then I'm going to pass it over because James is going to tell you about a more recent one. And this event, you see here, all these pictures are from that event. This was called Gather in the Clearing. It was a collaboration led by artist and scholar Chijor Azaglo, who is in the room with us today, and so happy that you're here, like I mentioned, as well as one of Chijor's collaborators, Crystal Bai, who is also an artist and teaches art at Mass Art. This collaboration also involved bringing community groups together, including the Muslim Justice League, Cambridge Heart, the Asian American Resources Workshop. And the reason why we gathered was because of a tragic police killing that took place in Cambridgeport of a young Bangladeshi youth at the beginning of 2022. In response to that, a group of people came together in this space, in this place of St. Augustine's. And you can understand why this place, why knowing the sedimented history of this place makes it especially powerful to gather there because of what has happened there for generations. And within these walls, Chijor, Crystal, and other artists put together an installation, including a window that everyone was encouraged to look through and to ask the question, what kind of practices of community can we imagine together by looking through this window? Again, the way the humanities ask us to use our imagination. There was an open mic, there was music presentation, there was the opportunity to share in common space, and there were other features of this installation that made it into much more than a performance in the sense of something you watch on stage, but this is a performance in which everybody in the room was active, right? There wasn't just audience and performer, everybody was an actor, and we were all acting in something called healing. We were all participating in something called healing, and that it was a beautiful experience to be part of that community healing event. James, do you want to talk about this?
Absolutely. So this is a more recent event. This is a more recent event which we just did on the 25th of last month, the Black Cambridgeport Sunday Matinee. You can see we had 3 parts to this. We had a poet, Emmanuel Apang-Yeboah, pictured here, a singer-songwriter, Grace Gibberts, a banjo player on the far right there, here. And then we had a conversation between Reverend Kate Eccles and myself about the history of the church. I want to give you the sort of theory behind this event and then talk about how it worked. We'll read and then we'll talk. Place making noises. So performance produces an autopoietic feedback loop of community that resists alienation, enclosure, isolation, and the loss of place. It does this through co-creation, wonder, and the unanticipated extemporaneous generation of meaning among participants. The arts and humanities create the conditions, the vessel that make autopoietic looping possible. So let's define this term. This is again from Erica Fischer-Lichte, which is like a performance theory term. This is in the context of Fischer-Lichte trying to define what performance is or what the art event is, right? And it essentially the idea is this: rather than thinking of performance as something which the performer does or something that the audience witnesses, the performance is the feedback loop between audience and performer. It is the space between, right? And you know about this if you've ever, for example, been to a classical music concert or a poetry event, right? Or a punk show, or I don't know, Rocky Horror or something. Every kind of performance has its own sort of standards that you do as an audience, right? Maybe I'm quiet, maybe I clap after the movement, or I clap after the song, or I snap in the middle of the thing, right? If you've ever, in the course of our presentation here, noticed the way you were sitting, or noticed what you were, or wondered if you were shuffling too loud, or whatever it is, these are all things that come from us chafing against conventions of performance, right? As audience members or as performers, right? But it is actually the space between that is the performance itself. So what does this mean for what we're doing at this event? The theory is you bring people into a place, right? You bring people into this historically significant place. And you put them into engagement with one another through performance. So you're watching Emmanuel read a poem, right? And in that coming together, that is the performance, in that feedback loop, you're generating community. Now, generally, when we think about community, we think about it as this sort of like these. How do I say something that exists, which you can interact with, or you can but it's in a sense sort of static. This is the community. We're serving the community, right? Instead, this is a different way of thinking about community as something which we are generating, an autopoietic, self-generating in space. Real time, right? When I was driving Grace home, Grace had never been to this church before, but she's been an active artist in Boston for many, many years and has also been an important advocate for like local Black history. She was amazed that she'd never heard of this place before. And she was so excited about it, and so excited to be a part of it, and so excited to go back and do more events and follow things in the future, and felt herself to be part of something which didn't exist before, in a sense, or rather, joining something which had already existed in other forms, right? But is remade, and remade many times over through events of this sort. So the working theory is that we don't always know what it's going to look like. And that's not the point. The point is creating the conditions where this can happen, right? Bringing people into the room, creating the conditions where this feedback looping can take place, and this then generates this community with which we can combat the forces of gentrification. This is the basic theory and the way that the performance event fits into it. One small anecdote about this. When Emmanuel started performing, he opened with a sort of sung hymn, and parishioners in the audience sang with him. No planning. It just happened. And it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And it spoke immediately to the power of this feedback loop to generate community in real time. And with that, I think we'll take
Kris, will you field your own questions?
Yes. And so we all need to answer. Great. love to hear what y'all think. Regine.
Thank you for this. This was really so rich and excellent, and I'm super excited on so many levels. Very personally, I'll share that I actually attend a church in Cambridge, which has a very large Caribbean population and was founded by some Bajan immigrants many, many years ago, I think like 50 years ago. So I have questions about the Caribbean population and church going in Boston and the waves of migration and how they get there, what you're seeing in terms of the history with that. And then I have a question about, I guess it's a comment. I love this framework, world making, aliveness, and imagination, which are all like very, you know, Black feminist words or theories, terms, frameworks that we're really obsessed with. And I'm curious to know, I'm a huge fan of the work of Kevin Quashie, and he has a book called Black Aliveness, which is tremendous and not popular enough, I think, outside of our very narrow field of literature or Black feminist studies. So please read it, Black Aliveness, everyone, and thank me. You'll be thanking me profusely. So my question is about aliveness and how do you see, because part of what Kevin is positing for people that don't know is just this idea, almost like a counter to the wake work that Christina Sharp is doing with this obsession we've had in Black studies with Black death, especially over the past 20 years, but obviously living in the wake of slavery and everything. And what he's positing is a kind of Black aliveness that is about not just our lives or our life, but this kind of energy, right, that we're infusing into the world. This is what I see you doing. So I wanted you to elaborate on aliveness and how you're seeing it, and is it somehow related to that? So Caribbean migrant paths to Cambridge, church-going Caribbean people, and Black lives.
Beautiful.
Please.
Yes, great questions. And I'll be really synoptic with the first question, which is the reasons why we have this very strong migration of Caribbean people to Cambridge, and really it's to Boston in general, is what I might just call the Great Caribbean Migration. You know, we talk about the Great Migration from the US South up to the North. There was simultaneously in that time, there was a Great Caribbean Migration that was taking place. And it had different reasons, but related reasons. One of the big reasons for this mass migration had to do with the fact that, you know, at the end of slavery led to the decline in plantation economies. In some cases, they got reinvigorated, but overall there was a drift from the land. There was a drift from the plantations, and people were drifting out then also to new horizons abroad. Especially Barbados is unique because Barbados had the quote unquote death of the plantations happen much earlier. And so there was already, for about 100 years, a strong move of Bayesian people into the professions. And so there was a very, very strong educated echelon in Barbados of Black folk who then were going abroad for education, for opportunity, for to join relatives, often as teachers, as nurses, going to medical school, you know, these kinds of pathways. So there was a kind of an educated migration channel that is very unique to Barbados, and because Cambridge, right, is the center for some very established educational institutions, it makes sense that they came to Cambridge. So I find that to be an interesting arc, which is maybe one that we might not have at the forefront of our mind in terms of different kinds of Black migrations during this great era of the Great Migrations. Now, in terms of aliveness, I so love that you invoke Kevin Quashie because he's one of my favorite authors. I mean, you know, thinkers and authors, including the previous book that he wrote, which was about quietness.
Sovereignty of quiet.
Sovereignty
He was
of.
here last year for the symposium, yes.
Oh, he's so profound. And so, yeah, exactly like you're asking, Regine, and I want to connect it to what we've been talking about, you know, in terms of the autopoietic feedback loop. James had a very nice way of glossing what autopoiesis means: self-generation of knowledge. Generation is when you create more than what was. Organisms, I mean, this term autopoiesis actually comes initially out of cognitive science. And it's a way of describing or defining what makes a living thing. A living thing, something that continues living, is able to reconstitute itself every day. It reproduces itself, which means that it creates more than what was. And human beings do that through our imagination, through our communities, through our faith, through a variety of different, internal, external powers that we tap into. So you might say that what Kwashi is interested in is the wonder of life, the wonder of aliveness, and I guess connecting it back to our theme, the wonder of Black life. And then also asking the question and reminding ourselves that one of the great powers of the humanities are that they track this power. They try to understand this power, to make sense of it, to decode it, right? And to apply it, and like we've been showing in this presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I love this too, and I appreciate your appreciation for the humanities as an enterprise. Grateful for your invoking Angel's memory at the onset of this. He was so committed to this kind of work. I wanted to, and the other thing I just love is that this is exemplifying the trend in public humanities to bring expertise from universities and student engagement into communities. And that's what I wanted to ask about. I wanted to ask about who's funding it and how, some of those sort of technical mechanisms. And I have a sort of vocabulary question, and that is around gentrification, which I always think of or have thought of as a real estate driven mechanism for driving some populations out and driving other populations in. And if that is a piece of what's being resisted here, and if so, how the arts and humanities and actually is effective in this other structural, more insidious enterprise.
I'll start with the last question. I think what we are saying is that the process of gentrification is also a failure of imagination. And it's in some ways, it is the failure to recognize the aliveness of communities that have already and have long and will continue to be embedded or rooted in various neighborhoods or urban spaces. And so if gentrification is not only a story about political economy, but if it's also a story about failures of our imagination to think about alternative futures than the one of privatization and older communities being pushed out, in this context, Black communities of color being pushed out to make room for white communities. If this is about a failure of imagination and there are other possibilities, the humanities are there to explore those and then to manifest them. And so that's connecting it to imagination, but connecting it like to political economy. It is also the case that the techniques of the historian, the techniques of the humanities scholar are actually really, really useful when you're trying to do deed work, for example, to figure out who owns this property, which was a bit of a challenge to figure that out. And then to do all the paperwork that you need to secure the deed and to create the trust that you need to oversee the deed so that it continues in perpetuity. So that's all humanities work. And I think for those of us in the humanities, for those of you in the humanities who are thinking of doing things in the humanities, just to remember that the techniques that you are learning actually have really, really powerful implications in the world. Like you can do things like save real property from being gentrified away by using the things that you know how to do, right? So I think that's important.
Can I add one small thing about that? I mean, to take another example of this that's quite recent, there are obviously a lot of developments happening in Alston, and a lot of it's Harvard. A huge building project that was sort of sunk a couple years ago, they threw a bone to the arts community in Alston by saying that they were going to have like murals on the side of it. And as someone who just had, I was one of 500 bands who lost our practice space to a biotech building in Alston just a couple months ago, and it was awful. But what happened was they were going to build this building and said, well, we'll have an artist, someone will do a mural on the side. And then people said, well, hold on a second. If you pay one artist to make a mural, That you know, this is conceiving of the arts community as something which is static and it's reified and dead in a sense, and you're memorializing it in this way, rather than serving the existing community. Part of what we do in creating or thinking about community through autopoiesis is the generation of community that is alive, right? And that's also growing, right? And so the more you do that work, the more you create a collective agent which can do claims making, right? And what we've done in Alston over the years in the arts community is to build up a resistant sort of artist community, which is now quite real and quite well organized, and is making serious change and is actually shaping the process of development in substantive ways. So I think we're thinking in these terms in Cambridgeport as well.
Yeah, autopoiesis connects to praxis. I mean, has a praxis that then comes out of it, like political implications that come out of it. That's really interesting. I see both of your hands at the back. I first want to see whether Michael, you had did you want to ask your question?
I did, but Laurie kind of got to half of it with the gentrification, and my other question was just about what's been going on with the church since the 60s. So, but I'm happy to defer actually to other students.
Great.
We can chat later.
Okay.
This is so fabulous, so thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, question in the back.
I'm curious because you just brought up that the coalition in Alston is like actively doing stuff to combat this gentrification. And something that I was wondering is like, so through the humanities, you're saying that like this lack of imagination that these people that are gentrifying these communities have, like it'll enlighten them or it'll inspire them to like change the processes that they're already going through. What are like the specific things that you're showing these people, and like what are you telling these those that are like gentrifying these communities, like what are these alternatives that would be better to them in their minds than just like profiting off of these spaces in the first place?
Well, I want to tweak the premise of the question somewhat, right? Because it's not so much that we are like creating the basis for an argument that we then bring against real estate interests. I think we're assuming real estate interests don't change. It's more about constituting community like a collective agent which can do the resisting in a more effective way, right? So personally, I don't think that there is any possibility of changing the mind of a developer who wants to make money. But just as an example, like, I mean, not to get sort of out of this particular project, but after losing 3 or 4 gigantic practice spaces over the last few years, when we were displaced out of the Sound Museum in Alston, we were able to bring enough pressure to bear that the Wu administration facilitated the opening of a new space to replace some of ours. So now we're in Dorchester and it's much farther, but we were displaced, and then about 3 or 4 months later, we were replaced in albeit inadequate building, right? And the theory is that we're going to be back in a new spot in Alston at some point in the future, but that did not happen in all the previous displacements. And part of what was done was there were all these community meetings with artists where, you know, the question was being raised, well, what do we want, right? And essentially it was, we want to be able to keep doing what we're doing here, right? But how that actually, like, I think another thing that's important is that we don't go in with the answers to those questions, right? The answers emerge through the process of community making, right? We're not going in with imagination and giving it to people, right? We are like trying to create spaces where the collective imagination can operate more effectively. Does that make sense?
Claire, did you have a?
Yeah, I think you may have ended up answering my question, but at some point you mentioned that the space is the performance. And I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit more about what that meant in general with your project.
Well, I mean, a performance can't be disentangled from the space is what it is, right? It's like the space is or the place you're doing it is a part of it. If we were doing this exact same event at St. Augustine's, for example, I think it would be quite different. Sometimes the ways in which that's so are difficult to pin down. But I think it goes back to this idea of not necessarily knowing where you're going, but just trying to create the space for something new. And in this case, doing this event that we did, for example, a couple weeks ago in the church, doing this interview with Reverend Eccles in the church and having him be able to gesture. That's George Alexander McGuire in the picture, right? Hearing stories about, again, the smells of the cooking percolating up from the floorboards and sitting in the pews, it's quite different. And in that sense, bringing the performance into that space means that the building, the surrounds, right, the environs become actually sort of generative of meaning, right? And so it's quite important for us not merely to do events about this church, but to do events in this church.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, you know, this theorist, and I have to thank again James for introducing me to the Fischer Lichte, who has written this, writes a lot about performance theory. I read one of her books recently, and she has this wonderful way of talking about all the things that happen in a performance space, including what she calls the tonality of it, meaning the way that the space itself has a certain tone, and even an emotional tone, that when you're in it, you feel something. Or she talks about orality. In other words, the ways that, like, when you're in a performance, you hear the people coughing, you know, and you get that sense of excitement that, oh, it's starting. That the space is actually doing something to you because of all of the unexpected, you know, elements, effects that are taking place, but that space makes possible. So along those lines, because Amber, you were also at the Black Cambridgeport matinee, could you maybe talk about some of what was happening that was specific to this space when we were in it? Yeah.
So that was my first time in the church. I was just in the audience. I wasn't actually presenting anything, but it was really, as you guys said, like you could really feel the memory in the space. Like we were sitting in the old pews from the church. I'm not sure how old they are, but I remember trying to sit so still because they kept creaking every time I moved, and I didn't want to interrupt. But I could feel that like memory and the noise in the church. And I remember I was sitting towards the back, and there was an older woman behind me who I'm assuming was a parishioner before also. And I could hear her whispering about memories she had about the church and talking about the community to who she was with. And yeah, there were several times during performances where the environment had like the emotional weight, not just the performance, but the environment held it too. And I cried several times. It was really beautiful. And it was like really an honor to be able to witness the history and not just witness it or look at it, but feel it embodied. And that's what made it so special, I think.
I think one more, maybe.
One more.
Two
Well,
more.
two more, okay. And then Sayara can have the last question, yes.
Just a quick question. What is the significance of this being an Orthodox church?
Yes.
Orthodox church. I mean, Ethiopia is the Orthodox
Yes,
country
thank you.
in Africa. And what is the connection with the Caribbean?
Yes, great question. And the answer is that the UNIA as a Pan-Africanist church, and let's also remember that Marcus Garvey in some ways, you know, the Rasta movement, Rastafarian movement, looks to Marcus Garvey as one of the precursors to the emergence of Rastafari, which looks to Ethiopia, of course, as its spiritual and political home. So the UNIA had this sense, which was an element of Pan-Africanism already since the 1850s and 60s, that in some ways Ethiopia is a civilizational home for Africans worldwide. So there was that element, which made Marcus Garvey and Maguire kind of interested in African Christian or Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, part one. Another dimension is actually much more contingent, which is that when Maguire, who was not a, what do you call? He was not, he had not become a priest. He
was not ordained.
Ordained. He had not been ordained as an Anglican priest because he was not, or an Anglican pastor. He was not permitted to because of the color line. In order to become a bishop, he had to first be ordained. And it seems that what happened is there was an Orthodox bishop in Cambridge that said, I will do it. You know, so there is something about the Orthodox Church in Cambridgeport that served as the bridge for Maguire to become an ordained minister, and then after that to become, you know, the head bishop of this new world congregation. So there's something about Orthodox solidarity there, which I think is really exciting, interesting. Yeah, thank you. Sayara, last question.
Thank you for the presentation. It was amazing. I'm gonna go look at the digital archive as well. I'm curious how it's organized. But my question is about the the factor you mentioned about sharing the authority, recognizing that all three of you are in academia and have this academic power within your presence in that space, how do you invite the community? How do you create that community outreach where power is equal?
Nice.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and I liked the language you used of authority and how do we disaggregate and distribute authority. And the concrete answer for us is that this nonprofit, Black History in Action for Cambridgeport, it has a kind of a governing body, and that body has members of the congregation sitting on it. So Reverend Eccles, the senior warden, who happens to be his brother, Sister Eloise, they're all members of it, along with, you know, those like myself who are part of the nonprofit. And so we've structured it in that way. I think there's a lot of emphasis on making sure that decisions are done, number one, collaboratively, but number two, that the worship community has the last say. You know, and there, I'll say this is actually quite interesting. There is a Black anthropologist and archaeologist named Michael Blakey, who is very well known, very important because he developed the New York African Burial Grounds project, which has become now a national site. And Michael Blakey, along with Leslie Rankin Hill, another very important Black archaeologist, they developed this model called the clientage model, which they've defined, which is a model that they used in the 1990s and 2000s to say when academics work with community, they must be servants of the community, and they must, in fact, ask the community members, what are the questions that you have that our area expertise can help address or can help affect? The community is in charge. The academics are the servers, you know, that's their clientage model. And it's kind of in the background of how we're moving forward with Black History in Action. So, and just one plug to both Michael Blakey and Leslie Rankin Hill. They are going to be at Northeastern on April 12th for an event. So look out for what they have to say.
Since the hour is late, I won't repeat the announcements, but I will encourage you to please keep an eye out for upcoming events of this series. Thank you. This was really wonderful, and you accomplished so much in the space of an hour. I mean, I'm becoming a student of what can happen in an hour. You really did that.
60 minutes.
Well, sometimes it's a lot. Yeah. And I also neglected to mention the culminating event of the Humanities Center this year will be a lecture by Sadia Hartman.
Wow.
You heard that right. April 11th at 5. Do you remember the time?
April 11th at 6:30. It's Jane Crow at the Gallows.
Yeah.
It's a new work that
Yeah,
Jane,
new
that
work.
Excited is working.
Yes.
That's
so
very
please come.
imaginative.